The smell of burnt coffee and regret hung in the air, a permanent perfume for the late-night shift. I swiped a damp cloth over the laminate countertop. The motion so practiced my muscles could do it in their sleep. It was 2 in the morning in the hazy glow of Los Angeles Koreatown, and the diner was a collection of ghosts, a trucker nursing a cup of black coffee, a couple of students cramming for finals over a plate of cold fries. I was Chloe, and this was my kingdom of cracked vinyl and sticky syrup dispensers. A group of regulars, loud and reeking of cheap beer, were getting rowdy in the corner booth. One of them, a guy named Rick who thought his $5 tip made him a king, bellowed for another round. I ignored him for a calculated 10 seconds, just long enough to assert that I was in charge of the coffee pot, not him. Competence was my armor. It was all I had. Then the bell over the door chimed, a tinny, cheerful sound that was entirely wrong for the men who stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the suit. Not just a suit, but a statement. It was charcoal wool, tailored so precisely it seemed to have been stitched directly onto the man's body. It moved with him, a second skin of quiet authority. He was flanked by 2 other men, both built like brick walls and less expensive, but still immaculate, black suits. They scanned the room with dead eyes, their purpose clear, to be invisible and lethal. But the man in the center, he was impossible to ignore. He moved like the room owed him space, and the air seemed to thin around him. His hair was black, cut sharp and clean. He didn't look at me, not at first. His gaze swept the diner once, a predator assessing its territory, before he slid into the booth farthest from the door. A position of power, a clear line of sight. I grabbed a menu, my footsteps sounding too loud on the checkered linoleum. "What can I get for you?" I asked, my voice flat, professional. He didn't look up from the tabletop, where his hands rested. They were elegant, long-fingered, with clean, clipped nails. A single, heavy silver ring sat on his right pinky, carved with a symbol I didn't recognize.
"Coffee," he said.
His voice was a low rumble, devoid of any accent I could place. It was just absolute, black. I turned to get it, the hairs on my arms standing on end. This was different. This wasn't a businessman or a tourist. This was a different category of person altogether. That's when Rick and his friends decided they were the apex predators in this particular pond. "Well, look what we have here," Rick drawled, shoving his chair back. He and his 2 buddies swaggered over to the man's booth. "Nice suit. You lost, buddy?" The fancy part of town is a few miles west. The man in the suit didn't move. He didn't even blink. He continued to stare at his hands as if Rick were nothing more than a buzzing fly. One of his guards tensed, a subtle shift in weight that I was probably the only one to notice. Rick, emboldened by the lack of reaction, leaned over the table, getting in the man's face. "I'm talking to you." The man slowly lifted his head. His eyes were dark, a shade of brown so deep they were almost black, and utterly empty of emotion. It was like looking into a well. He held Rick's gaze for a long, silent moment. The temperature in the diner seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You are," he said, his voice still quiet, yet it cut through the greasy air like a razor. The simplicity of the statement seemed to enrage Rick. He was used to bluster and threats, not this surgical calm. He scoffed, looking for his audience. His eyes landed on me. "Hey, sweetheart," he sneered, his gaze slimy. "This guy bothering you? We can take care of him for you." He took a step toward me, reaching out to grab my arm. "Think you're tough?" Rick's friend laughed, poking one of the guards in the chest. "Prove it." It happened fast. Before the man's guards could move, before the man himself could even rise, Rick's hand clamped down on my forearm. The touch was possessive, insulting. And in that instant, a lifetime of being underestimated, of having to be tougher and smarter just to get by, coalesced into a single, clarifying point of action. I didn't scream. I didn't pull away. I acted. I had a fresh, steaming pot of coffee in my right hand. With my left, I grabbed Rick's wrist, using his own momentum to twist his arm back. He grunted in surprise, his grip faltering. I pivoted, slamming his hand, palm down, onto the searing hot surface of the commercial grill behind the counter. A raw, animal scream tore from his throat. The sickening sizzle of flesh meeting hot metal filled the sudden, absolute silence of the diner. He wrenched his hand back, clutching it to his chest, his face pale with shock and agony. His friends were frozen, their drunken bravado evaporating like steam. I set the coffee pot down with a steady hand, my heart hammering against my ribs not with fear, but with a cold, sharp adrenaline. I looked past Rick's whimpering form, my eyes landing on the man in the suit. He was watching me, and for the first time, there was something in his eyes. Not shock, not approval. It was recognition. A flicker of something ancient and predatory that saw a kindred spirit in the dark. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. That was the moment everything changed. The spell broke. Rick's friends lunged, not at me, but at the man who had witnessed their humiliation. It was a fatal mistake. The two guards moved. It wasn't a fight. It was a disassembly. One moment, Rick's buddies were on their feet. The next, they were on the floor, broken and silent, dispatched with a brutal, silent efficiency that spoke of countless hours of training. The sirens began to wail in the distance. The trucker had called the cops. The man in the suit slid out of the booth. He walked to the counter, his expensive leather shoes making no sound. He stopped in front of me, so close I could smell the faint, clean scent of cedar and smoke clinging to his suit. He looked at my face, then at my hands, which were now trembling slightly. "You have a mess," he observed calmly. He placed a black credit card on the counter. It was heavy, made of metal, with no name or number, only that same embossed silver symbol from his ring. "For the damages. For your silence. And for your trouble." His dark eyes held mine. "I will be in touch." Then he and his men were gone, melting into the night seconds before the first police cruiser screamed into the parking lot. I stood there, the smell of burnt skin and coffee filling my lungs, staring at the black card that felt like a contract I had just signed in blood. The next day, a black sedan was waiting for me when I left my apartment. A man in a suit, not one of the two from the diner, got out. He didn't threaten me. He didn't have to. His polite emptiness was more terrifying than any weapon. "Mr. Kwan does not like loose ends," he said, his voice a polished monotone. "Or witnesses who are not his own." He opened the back door of the car. "It wasn't a request. You work for him now." My new workplace was not an office. It was a sprawling penthouse in a glass tower that stabbed the sky over downtown Los Angeles. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, a glittering carpet of lights that felt a million miles away from my world of cracked linoleum. I was a prisoner in a gilded cage, my job deliberately vague. I was to stay here, to be available, to be watched. Mr. Kwan, as I now knew to call him, was a ghost in his own home. He would be gone for days, then reappear without a word, his presence a subtle shift in the atmosphere. I was given a room, clothes I could never afford, and food prepared by a silent housekeeper. I was also given absolute silence. He rarely spoke to me. I was an object he had acquired, a problem he had contained by bringing it into the heart of his empire. From my cage, I watched him. I saw men in expensive suits come and go, their faces grim, their conversations conducted in low, urgent tones. I saw the cold, tactical mind at work as he stood before the windows, phone pressed to his ear, issuing commands that I knew were reshaping the city's underworld. He moved through his violent world like it was a language he was born speaking, never panicked, only quiet and lethal. I learned to read the nuances of his stillness. The subtle tension in his jaw meant a deal had gone south. The way his fingers would trace the symbol on his ring meant a betrayal was being dealt with. He was a creature of absolute control, his emotions locked away behind a mask of cold indifference. But sometimes, late at night, the mask would slip. One evening, I couldn't sleep. The silence of the penthouse was louder than the diner had ever been. I wandered into the main living area, drawn by a sliver of light from under his study door. I knew I shouldn't, but I crept closer. The door was ajar. He was standing with his back to me, staring at a small, framed photograph on his desk. His shoulders, usually so straight and rigid, were slumped. For a single, unguarded moment, he looked broken. The air around him was thick with a grief, so profound it felt like a physical weight. He didn't see me. I retreated back to my room, my heart pounding, having seen something I was never meant to see. A few days later, one of his lieutenants, a younger man named Gene who sometimes showed me a sliver of kindness, found me on the balcony. "He's not always like this," Gene said, startling me. He gestured vaguely toward the study. "The man you see now, he was different before." I stayed silent, knowing that asking questions in this world was a mistake. Years ago, his fiancée, Jimin, was killed. Gene continued, his voice low. "A car bomb. It was meant for him. A message from a rival family, sent with help from the inside. His own cousin sold him out. He looked out at the city lights. He built this empire on her memory, on the promise that he would never be weak enough to lose someone he was meant to protect again. That is the debt he carries. His wound. The one vulnerability he kept hidden from the world. It wasn't just loss, it was failure. A failure of his protection, a betrayal by his own blood. Suddenly, the coldness, the control, it all made a terrible kind of sense. He hadn't just lost a woman he loved, he had lost the man he was with her. The knowledge changed how I saw him. I no longer saw just the monster. I saw the man the monster was built to protect. The war with the rival faction, the Parks, escalated. It moved from the shadows into the open. One afternoon, Kwon was taking me somewhere. He never explained where we were going when it happened. We were in the back of one of his armored sedans, gliding through the city streets. I was watching the blur of palm trees when a dump truck, appearing from nowhere, slammed into our side with the force of a freight train. The world became a chaotic symphony of screaming metal and shattering glass. The car spun, the force throwing me across the seat. Before I could even process what was happening, Kwon's body was covering mine. He shielded me with his own weight, his arm clamped over my head, pressing me down as the car finally skidded to a halt. The sharp crack of gunfire erupted outside. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a low growl in my ear, his breath warm against my skin. Through the shattered window, I saw them, men with automatic weapons, swarming our vehicle. Gene, in the front seat, was returning fire. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and burning rubber. In the midst of the chaos, my door was wrenched open. For a split second, I had a clear path. I could run. I could scramble out of the car and disappear into the terrified crowds on the sidewalk. I could go back to being Chloe from the diner, a ghost in a city of millions. Freedom was right there. But then I saw it. A dark stain spreading across the side of Kwon's pristine white shirt, just below his ribs. He was hit. He grunted in pain as he shifted to get his own weapon, his face pale but his eyes burning with a cold, lethal fire. I made a choice. I didn't run. I stayed. I reached out, tearing a strip of fabric from the hem of my own shirt. I pressed the makeshift bandage against his wound, my hands surprisingly steady. "Pressure," I said, the words sounding thin and useless in the roar of the firefight. He glanced down at my hand on his side, then back at my face. His expression was unreadable, but the intensity in his gaze pinned me in place. The world outside was exploding, but in that moment, the entire universe shrank to the space between us, to the feeling of his warm blood on my fingertips. They fought off the attackers. It was bloody, efficient, and over in minutes. We abandoned the wrecked sedan and were bundled into a different vehicle that appeared out of a side street. We drove to an unfamiliar, sterile-looking apartment, a safe house. Kwon slumped onto a leather sofa, his breathing shallow. Gene was on the phone, his voice tight. "We need a doctor." "No." Kwon bit out, his voice strained. "No doctors. No one outside the family." He looked at me, his dark eyes narrowed in pain and calculation. "You." My blood ran cold. "Me? I don't know what I'm doing. I took a first aid class once, at a community college." "Get the kit," he ordered Gene, ignoring my protest. A few minutes later, I was kneeling in front of him, a medical kit open on the floor. His suit jacket was gone, his shirt unbuttoned, revealing the jagged piece of shrapnel embedded in the flesh of his side. The sight of his vulnerability was unnerving, intimate. My hands trembled as I cleaned the wound. "This is going to hurt," I whispered. "I'm aware," he said, his voice tight. He was watching my face, not the wound. His focus was absolute, unnerving. I took a deep breath, picked up the tweezers, and pulled the metal free. He hissed, his body going rigid, but he made no other sound. Now came the worst part. The stitches. The needle felt alien in my fingers. As I prepared to make the first stitch, my hand shook violently. His hand covered mine. The touch was not controlling. It was firm, warm, and steadying. His skin was calloused against my own. He wasn't stopping me. He was helping me. For that 1 second, we were not a monster and his prisoner. We were just two people in a quiet room, bound by an act of violence and a desperate need for trust. I took another breath, and this time, my hand was steady. I began to sew his skin back together, the silence between us charged with everything we could not say. Life in the penthouse became a state of permanent tension. I was no longer just a witness. I was an accessory. That night in the safe house had changed the dynamic between us. He still rarely spoke, but now, when he was in a room, I could feel him watching me. And I, in turn, found my eyes drifting to him, tracing the sharp line of his jaw or the way his hands rested on his desk, always still, always ready. One night, searching for a book in his vast library, I stumbled upon it. Tucked away in a ledger filled with shipping manifests and financial records was a file detailing a subsidiary of his corporation. It was a predatory lending company, targeting low-income neighborhoods with impossible terms. Neighborhoods like the one I grew up in. They were bleeding people dry, ruining lives for profit. The diner, the sticky countertops, my entire old life. He owned the company that was strangling it. The knowledge was a punch to the gut. It was one thing to know he was a killer, a crime boss. It was another to see, in black and white, the casual, systemic cruelty that funded his empire. This was the thing that should have made me run. This was the poison I couldn't ignore. Every part of me screamed to hate him, to find a way out, to escape the man who built his throne on the backs of people like me. But then, the war with the Parks reached its crescendo. An explosion rocked the top floor of a hotel where Kwon was having a meeting. I saw it on the news from the penthouse, a plume of black smoke against the twilight sky. For 12 terrifying minutes, there was silence. No word from Jean, no updates. Just the cold, sick certainty that he was gone. The relief that washed over me when Jean finally called to say Kwon was alive, bruised, furious, but alive, was so potent it made me nauseous. And in that moment, I had to face a terrible truth. My feelings for him were no longer simple. They were tangled up with fear, fascination, and something else, something I refused to name. The attack meant the Parks had an informant. Kwon needed to know who it was, and what their next move was. Jean discovered the Parks were using a private, encrypted server to communicate. The only way in was through a low-level IT tech, a man named Leo. And I knew him. Leo used to come into the diner all the time, a sad, lonely man with a gambling problem and a desperate crush on me. He'd always overtip and try to make awkward conversation. I knew his weaknesses. Kwon didn't ask me. He didn't have to. Jean laid the file on the table in front of me. Leo works security at the server farm, he said quietly. He'll be at his usual bar tonight. He trusts you. I looked from the file to Kwon, who was standing by the window, watching the city. He didn't turn around. This was my choice. I could refuse. But I knew what was at stake. If the Parks won, his entire organization would crumble, and I would be just another piece of collateral damage. Staying with him was survival. But this was different. This was participation. That night, I found Leo at the bar. I let him buy me a drink. I smiled. I listened to his problems. I let him believe he had a chance. And when the moment was right, I told him a story about being in trouble, about needing to access a file for a friend. I used his loneliness against him, turning it like a key in a lock. He gave me his login credentials and a key card, believing he was helping me, believing he was my hero. Walking out of that bar, I felt filthy. I had crossed a line I could not uncross. I had used a person's kindness as a weapon. Back at the penthouse, I handed the key card and the password to Jean without a word. I went to stand on the balcony, needing the cold night air to breathe. A few minutes later, Kwon stepped out beside me. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. "You see the world as it is," he said, his voice low. "Not as you wish it was. That is a rare thing." It wasn't a compliment. It was a statement of fact. He was acknowledging the darkness in me that mirrored his own. I told myself that staying here was about survival. I said, my voice barely a whisper. I think I've been lying to myself. It was the most honest thing I had ever said to him. It was a confession, not of love, but of complicity. He turned to face me, and in the faint light from the city below, I saw the hard lines of his face soften almost imperceptibly. He reached out, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from my cheek. The touch was light as a ghost, yet it burned a trail on my skin. The information I'd stolen from Leo proved invaluable. It revealed the traitor in Kwon's organization and laid out the park's entire strategy. But it also revealed something else.
They knew about me.
They didn't know who I was exactly, but their informant had told them there was a woman. Someone who was always with Kwon. They saw me as his weakness, a vulnerability to be exploited. The next day, Jean insisted I get some fresh air. A supervised walk in the private garden on the building's rooftop. It was the first time I'd been outside in weeks. The sun on my skin felt glorious. But the feeling didn't last. Two men, dressed as gardeners, moved toward me. Their eyes were wrong. Their hands were reaching. Before my two guards could react, they were on me. One clamped a hand over my mouth. I was being dragged toward the service stairs. They were taking me. They were going to use me to get to him. The final confrontation was inevitable. The attempt to kidnap me was the last move the Parks would ever make. Kwon returned to the penthouse that evening, and the cold fury radiating from him was a living thing. The air crackled with it. He was going to end this. Tonight. He laid out a plan for a surgical strike on the Park's headquarters, a fortified restaurant downtown. "You will stay here," he told me. It was an order, absolute and final. "You will be safe."
He thought he was protecting me.
But I was done being protected. I was done being a pawn. As his men prepared, their movements crisp and silent as they checked weapons and radios, I thought about Leo. I thought about the information I had coaxed out of him. He hadn't just given me his password. In his rambling, lonely monologue, he had complained about his job, about having to make late-night maintenance runs to the Park's restaurant. He'd mentioned a service entrance in the sub-basement, used for off-the-books deliveries, an entrance that wasn't on any of the official blueprints. An unguarded way in. I found Jean as he was heading for the door. "They're expecting you to come through the front or the roof," I said, my voice low and urgent. "They're not expecting you to come up from the sewers." I drew him a quick, crude map on a napkin, showing him where Leo had said the entrance was. Jean stared at the napkin, then at me. A slow understanding dawned in his eyes. He nodded once, tucked the napkin into his pocket, and left. I had not just waited to be rescued. I had given them the blade. I spent the next 2 hours pacing the length of the penthouse, the city lights below a meaningless blur. Every siren I heard in the distance was a knife in my gut. I didn't know what I was waiting for or what I hoped the outcome would be. I only knew that my life, the one I had known, was over. A new one was being forged tonight in fire and blood. He returned just before dawn. The door opened, and he was there, framed in the doorway. He was not pristine anymore. His perfect suit was torn and stained with blood, some of it his, most of it not. A fresh cut angled across his cheekbone. He looked weary, down to his bones, but he was alive. And he was victorious. Behind him, his men were fewer than when they had left. Jean was not among them. A cost is always paid. Nothing in this world is free. He walked into the room, his eyes finding me immediately. He crossed the space between us, the predatory grace still there despite his exhaustion. He stopped in front of me, the smell of cordite and iron clinging to him. The mask was gone. In its place was a raw, unguarded intensity that stole the air from my lungs. "They targeted you because they thought you were my weakness," he said, his voice rough. He took another step, closing the remaining distance between us. His hand came up, not to touch my hair, but to cup my jaw, his thumbs stroking my skin. "They were wrong. You are my strength." It was not a declaration of love. It was something more vital, more elemental. It was an acknowledgement, a claiming. He let his hand drop. "The parks are finished. My empire is secure," he said, his voice regaining some of its usual control. "You are free to go. I will have my men take you anywhere you want. A new name, a new life. It is yours." The choice was real. I could see it in his eyes. He would let me walk away. I could disappear, try to find some semblance of a normal life, forever looking over my shoulder. I thought of the diner, of the endless nights, the sticky tables, the casual disrespect. That girl was a ghost. She had burned away in the sizzle of a man's hand on a hot grill. I looked at Kwan's face, at the exhaustion and the violence and the terrible, lonely power etched there. I looked at the blood on his collar. I knew what staying meant. It meant a life in the shadows, a world of loyalty and debt written in blood. It meant becoming something I never thought I would be. He held out a hand, a formal, final offer. I didn't take it. Instead, I stepped past his hand, moving into his space until the fabric of my clothes brushed against his blood-stained shirt. My hands came up, not to embrace him, but to begin the slow, deliberate work of unbuttoning his shirt. My fingers were steady. It was not a gesture of seduction. It was a gesture of care, of ownership, an answer that needed no words, spoken in the quiet language of intimacy we had forged in violence. He stood perfectly still, letting me. I had made my choice. I was no longer a witness to his world. I was home.